Hi everybody, Anna Kubrick here, and today I'm going to be talking to you about a specific brain injury called a concussion. And we're going to talk about why it's important for us as future counselors to know about concussions and how it's going to affect us in our future career. So, background information. What exactly is a concussion? A concussion is a type of traumatic brain injury, or a TBI, caused by a bump, blow, or jolt to the head, or by a hit to the body that causes the head and the brain to move quickly back and forth. This fast movement can cause the brain to bounce around or twist in the skull, creating chemical changes in the brain and sometimes stretching and damaging the brain cells. This is from Heads Up, which is a division of the Center for Disease Control and Prevention that offers information about concussions to parents, players, coaches, athletes, and everyone else involved in youth sports. The Heads Up initiative provides information that's super important on preventing, recognizing, and responding to a concussion on the playing field or even in the classroom setting. So what actually happens to the brain when a concussion occurs? Well, according to the newspaper of the National Association of School Psychologists, it challenges or changes the balance between the brain chemicals within the cell, which is normally potassium, and the chemicals outside the cell, which is normally calcium. And as a result of this challenge and change, the brain cell whose job is to supply the brain with fuel or glucose is compromised. The more demand that's placed on the brain for fuel, the more potential it is for the student to flare a symptom, headaches, fatigue, anything like that. This explanation comes from Giza and Hovda in some of their research from 2001. So immediately after a concussion, the simplest, smallest type of physical or mental demand can bring about super severe symptoms. Within a few days, the brain will begin to heal and the cells will begin to heal themselves. But before that happens, even the lightest kind of activity can flare up symptoms, yet symptoms usually become more tolerable, more short-lived, as healing kind of permits a little bit more and more. So a brain injury is obviously a physical injury, but it also affects cognition and causes changes in emotions, behaviors, and the psychological aspect of the individual. The multifaceted nature of the injury requires individualized treatment and becoming cognizant of the fact that each person will heal at a different rate, which will require creative approaches in school and activity. Since 2014, all 50 states have youth sport concussion laws and protocols set in place. About 25% of these states require that coaches have specific concussion management training. About 80% of the states require that coaches at least get information on concussions. So some of us aren't coaches, some of us may not have kids that are going to end up playing sports. Why does this matter to us as future counselors? Because while not all children who sustain concussions are athletes, all children who sustain concussions are students, and those students could possibly be ours one day. So, what's the instance? How many concussions do we have a year? Why is the number so high? All that kind of stuff. In early 2014, the CDC presented data that estimated that 1.7 million traumatic brain injuries are had each year, and about 75% of those are concussions. Later in 2014, the CDC predicted that 1.6 to 3.8 million people will receive concussions just from sports and different physical activities. This number, huge number, does not even account for any kind of motor accidents, falls, or any violent situations. According to Heads Up, 69% of athletes continued to play with a concussion, and 40% of coaches didn't even know that their athletes were playing with a concussion in the first place. Teens are more vulnerable because of their frontal lobes that are growing in spurts, which makes them more susceptible to injury. So, teenager, you're kind of already screwed. But as a female, you're prone to higher rates of concussive injuries compared to male athletes of the same sport. So from momteams.com, they say that girls may be at a higher risk of concussion because their heads are smaller, so it has less mass, giving it more space to kind of bobble around in your skull, or because their neck muscles are less developed than boys, and they're not as good as their boys' necks at absorbing shock of impact. Another reason could be that many doctors think that the athletic trainers are paying more attention to girls' injuries than boys' injuries because society has this idea that they have to protect girls more. So every time that a girl gets an injury, it's very important that we check them out and they give them the whole 100%. When boys sometimes are kind of like just brush your shoulder off and go back on the field. They also think that girls may self-report at a higher rate than the boys do, but at the same time, boys also underreport because they think that men are usually more competitive, so they don't want to lose their spot on the team, or they just don't understand how important and how dangerous concussions can be. Another reason is because when they have the same sport, sometimes a girl and a boy have different protective gear on. So for example, ice hockey, men wear helmets, mouth guards, their skull is fully protected and fully encased. Compared to field hockey, the girls wear eye goggles and mouth guard. To men's lacrosse, where the men wear a fully encompassing helmet and a mouth guard, and women only have to wear goggles and a mouth guard. The goalies do get to wear helmets, but that's it. No one else on the field can wear a helmet unless it's specifically approved by the overhanging organization. So what are the defining features of a concussion? First off, and most importantly, they reflect functional deficits such as loss of memory, concentration, processing speed, reaction time, and coordination. It's also super important to remember that a physical sign will not be present with a concussion. Yes, they'll have physical symptoms, but they won't have anything physically wrong with them. There's no bruising, there's no scratching, there's no bleeding or anything like that because it's truly an internal injury. So because of that, it's also important to know that an MRI or a CAT scan is not sensitive enough to actually diagnose a concussion. So when you have an athletic trainer or a doctor working with someone that has a concussion, they're only going based off of this symptom wheel, and they can't use any kind of test besides we're going to be talking about later. So some of the most important symptoms to recognize when you're dealing with someone that could possibly have a concussion is that there's headaches, nausea, feeling in a fog, trouble falling asleep, fatigue, sensitivity to light or noise, kind of feeling dinged or dazed or stunned. There's tinnitus, which is the ringing of the ears, dizziness, vomiting, feeling slowed down, sleeping more than usual, drowsiness, loss of balance, seeing stars or double vision. But it's important to remember that loss of consciousness during concussion or a different type of head injury only occurs about 8.9% of the time. So you can't say that just because someone lost the consciousness means that they have a concussion, and just because they didn't lose their consciousness, they did have a concussion. So it's always kind of important to remember that. So why does this matter to us as future counselors? As I discussed before, if we're working with teenagers in a middle school or a high school setting, it's important to know that their brains are still developing and it's going slowly and in spurts. So, a concussion falls into the realm of special education under the IDEA Act. So, it's an acquired injury to the brain caused by an external force, resulting in total or partial functional disability or psychosocial impairment, or even both, that adversely affects a child's educational performance. So, the diagnosis of a concussion is a medical decision. Yes, we're not doctors. Clearance from a concussion is also a medical decision. We're also not doctors, so we can't do that either. But how we actually adjust the academic demands during the recovery for a student from a concussion is a task that's uniquely suited for us because we work at the school and we work with the student. So what's most important to remember is that there's an adverse effect on the educational performance when we're working with students who could possibly be dealing with a concussion. Besides a TBI diagnosis, a student could also be working with an SLD or a specific learning disability, intellectual disabilities, or an emotional disturbance. So determined by this idea that there's multiple reasons and things that can happen with a concussion, it's important to know about how the student got the concussion, the severity of the concussion, the effects of the student's symptoms, and how that's going to be working with their grades and stuff, and how we actually know the student. So what do we know about their medical information? What do we know about their behaviors? Because this is all going to be helping us when we're working with the student transitioning back to learning. So why does this matter to future counselors? The issues that the students will face in the classroom are endless when they're recovering from a concussion. Students may have long-term or even small residual side effects after the recovery period is said to be complete. So when a student returns to school following any type of injury, the school's team is responsible to assess the needs, design an intervention plan, monitor the effectiveness of the plan, and adjust and even readjust into the plan until the student returns back to school, no longer needing special needs for the condition. Returning to school from a concussion is no different. So, upon return to school, students may face difficulties with the bright lights in class due to the head injury. They may have attentional difficulties, like a lack of concentration for a whole class period, or even an inability to focus during study hall when it's more of an independently driven kind of issue. Behavioral issues may also impact their educational and social interactions. They may have visual and memory deficits, motor difficulties, physical and mental fatigue, and their emotional well-being. So the three most important things to look at when we're making academic adjustments for students upon their returning to learn is their mental fatigue, their slowed processing speed, difficulty with new learning that they may face. So as each concussed students will have a different combination of symptoms, a different level of severity of injury, and a different rate of recovery, it's important that we make each academic adjustment plan also individualized. This is kind of where the idea of special education comes in, because it can be used as a 504 or an IEP, depending on the severity and the number of concussions that a student has had. So the process of assess, intervene, monitor, process, and adjust repeats until the student is recovered from the actual concussion itself. So on average, statistics say that 80% to 90% of students do recover within 1 to 3 weeks. Therefore, it's super important that we kind of front load and kind of jam pack all of those accommodations and modifications in, because it's easier to kind of give them all up at once and then kind of take away what they need, what they don't need so much, instead of giving them only a few and realizing it's not working, because it's going to take them that much longer to now get back on the road to recovery and back on the road into the classroom. So eventually the student will be able to work cognitively and physically more and more each day, and they're going to have less and less symptoms as the recovery period goes on. So if we are dealing with a student that has severe mental fatigue, some accommodations and modifications that can happen that will work for them is giving them a shorter day. It can be a later start or an earlier dismissal, depending on like their peak time of the day. So some students will wake up and they'll feel 100%, and they decide that should be the best time for them, compared to some people kind of work and then they kind of fall, and that's when they start to feel their fatigue. So it really works with whatever is for the student. We also want to make sure that we're giving the student frequent rest periods so they're not exerting too much cognitively at once. We also want to cut back the amount of work for students, give them or allow them to wear sunglasses if they have any light sensitivity, and even earphones for sound sensitivity. If they are dealing with a slowed processing speed, also cut down the amount of work, because sometimes that gives them too much mental overexertion, and that's up to the teacher's discretion what they think is the most important work that they need to be doing. So we want to emphasize that they're working for quality of the work, not the quantity. We also want to make sure that we give them extra time on projects and tests and adjust the due dates for when they're actually able to work a little bit more. Use a tape recorder, a note taker, or even use a teacher's notes when they are learning something new. And the use of organizational helpers or technology. If they can stand using lights, maybe have them be able to use their laptop instead, so they can kind of type a little bit faster instead of handwriting it all the time. And if a student faces difficulty with new learning, we want to make sure that we're thoughtful of the most important information to teach. Because the learning process is compromised during a concussion, we want to make sure that we're picking out the most important lessons of them to learn and what's going to be the most impactful for them, and that they have the best chance of remembering. We also want to make sure that we're removing or exempting tests and large projects for them, because there's a good chance that their absences will fluctuate and their presence in class will fluctuate more during this time of recovery. We also want to focus on understanding the important information, not just memorizing it, because there is a good chance that the student may be dealing with some memory deficits during this time. We also want to make sure that we're removing, not postponing the work. If you postpone a work too much, it's going to be entirely impossible for a student to be able to catch up and still be on the same page as the other students at the end of the day. So some additional accommodations and modifications that you can use when you're working with your students is that you want to work with their teachers and their friends. Monitor and discuss with them increased problems like paying attention and concentrating, problems remembering or learning new information. If they have a longer time that's needed to complete tasks, make sure we kind of find that out. Increased symptoms during schoolwork, find them more irritable, and they might also have a less tolerance for stressors. So other things that we can do that are more in the classroom for the teachers to work with is that we can have them outline or list steps for assignments, provide written instructions for everything that's being done, have a notebook or agenda for writing down tasks to be completed, have a frequent review of learned information so we make sure that the student is picking up what's being taught and it's not going to just kind of float away in their memory that's not functioning properly. We also want to make sure that we give them distraction-free work areas while they are working, and when they kind of need a second to relax and calm themselves back down, they have a quiet area for refocusing. Something else that's super important to help support them and assist them during this time is to become become familiar with the post-concussive symptoms scale that their doctors and athletic trainers will be using, because this way everyone involved is on the same page and everyone knows what everyone else is talking about. Something else that's super important is that we want to make sure that we're staying on top of the student recovery and the strength of the academic adjustments. So when adjustments are at their maximum, we want to make sure that we don't need to put in anything about their attendance, because what they are learning in the classroom is working with everything else to make sure that their concussion is healing properly. We also want to make sure that we're keeping in touch with doctors, athletic trainers, if it was an athletic injury, teachers, and parents, because this is the kind of thing that's going to help us overall make sure the student is functioning educationally and social and emotionally, just to make sure that the student is going back to be 100% to what they were. Something also that's super important to remember is that we need to make sure that students are not playing or becoming physical before their concussion is healed, because when a student has a concussion, it's very easy for them to have multiple concussions afterwards, and these things can eventually, if you keep getting bumped in the head, could possibly lead to a disability further down the road. So in those cases, it's important to remember that we have to reach out as much as possible to make sure that this kid is going to come back 110%, because of the things that could be lurking down the road, like other cognitive, emotional, or behavior concerns in the future. And these are my resources. And that's it.